Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Gaines about to read you chapter 12. With this chapter, I'm afraid I need to read it in two separate sections because it's quite a long chapter. Okay, so here we go then. Shrimps. Next morning, Rosie told Jim that he would have to help her if she was going to feed him. She tied an old sack over his shoulders to disguise the workhouse clothes in case the police saw him. "You'll have to keep moving, Jim, same as me," she warned him. "If the bobbies see me standing still, they'll soon pack me off as well. We'll both be running all day." Jim liked working for her. When her voice grew tired, he would shout out for her, "Well, clothes, salmon for sale, pickled fish and shrimp, so." He danced round while he was shouting, partly to keep himself warm and partly so he could watch out on all sides for the policeman coming. He had such a light, skipping way of dancing that people stopped to watch him on their way to the shops and offices. They soon got to know him. "Skip for us, Jimmy," they used to say, especially if they saw him standing on his own. "Buy some more shrimps and I will," Jim would say, and Rosie would set up her tray with seafood and persuade them to buy something. While they were eating, Jim would dance for them, and he would close his eyes, close out the street, close out the faces of all the strangers. A long time ago, his father danced for him in their cottage. Jim could just remember the laughing faces of Emily and Lizzie as they sat on the long polished bench by the fire. He had been a very small boy then. He remembered clapping his hands and shouting out as far as his father danced, and the faster his father jumped, the more the flames in the fire had danced, like wild yellow spirits. "Faster, Pa, faster!" the children had shouted, and the black shadow that leapt from his father's feet had become a crazy, long-limbed, prancing shape across the walls and the ceiling, and Jim had jumped down and run to do a skipping dance with him, and been lifted up to the beams. There he was in the room again, while strangers watched him and ate Rosie's seafood. "I'm very pleased with you, Skipping Jim," Rosie told him, breaking into his dream. "I'm selling more salmon than I can pickle. They'll have to have it boiled plain if they want more like this, and like it." He'd been staying with Rosie a few days when he first saw the doctor. He and Rosie were going back to the cottage one afternoon when they heard a voice behind them calling, "Rosie! Rosie Trilling!" And they turned around to see lame Betsy limping after them, holding up her skirts as she tried to hurry through the mud. "I've been worrying about the boy," Betsy panted. "Whether he'd find you, and whether you could give him a home, and how he was doing." "He's doing fine," Rosie laughed. "He's a real little dancing man, ain't he, Jim? But he can't stay with me for long, he knows that. I'm in mortal fear of my grandfather finding him and throwing us both out. You know what he's like, Betsy." Betsy stuffed her loose hair back under her cap. "Well, I have a fine plan." She held out her hand, plump and pink with cold. "You come on with me, Jim. I'm going to take you to school." Jim's stomach churned with terror. "I hate school," he shouted. "I hate school teachers." He tried to pull himself away from Betsy. "He's not a school teacher, Jim. He's a doctor, so they say. And he's a school going for the likes of you, Jim. He's a queer soul, they say, and he stands on a box in the middle of the street, and he asks people to bring their children along to his school, and he don't charge him nothing." She stopped for a breath, banging her chest with her fist. She held out her hand again. "Come on, Jim. It's a fine chance for you." Jim felt the tears scorching. "Please don't make me. Don't make me go to the school." But Rosie pushed him gently towards Betsy. "Go with her, Jim," she said. "Somewhere to go where you'll be warm and dry, and it's free." "Wish I had the chance to go to school." "But I want to help you, Rosie," Jim called out, but Rosie hurried away from them. Betsy pulled him along with her, squeezing out comforting words between her breathly wheezings. "You'll hear Bible stories, or I should think, and you'll sing lots of nice hymns. I don't want you getting into bad ways, Jim, just because you ain't got a mother and father. Look at the crowd. That'll be him talking now. Betsy pushed him to the front of the crowd. A thin man with spectacles and fluffy side whiskers was standing on a box, turning from side to side. He spoke in the light, soft voice with an Irish accent, which Jim could hardly understand. Some of the people watching were laughing, and a group of ragged boys were jeering. The man didn't seem to hear them, but just kept on talking in his gentle voice. Jim strained to hear what he was saying, and then caught the words that he dreaded. It was almost as if he'd been hauled by the scruff of his neck into the long, dim schoolroom in the workhouse, with Mr. Barrack slicing the air with his whistling rope. "God is love," said the doctor. "God is good." "No, he ain't," Jim shouted. "He ain't good to me." Everybody broke into a roar of cheering laughter and shouts. One of the boys on the corner picked up a lump of mud and flung it at the doctor. It landed with a splash across his face, stopping up his mouth as he opened it to speak again. The doctor coughed and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. He was jostled off his crate. He pushed his way through the crowd, struggling to keep his hat on his head. As he passed, Jim looked at him just for a second, and what Jim saw in his eyes wasn't anger or reproach, but sadness. Jim turned away. Betsy was wiping her eyes on her sleeve. "Go on," she laughed. "Back to your Rosie, you vagabond. There's not much you don't know." Jim raced off through the alleyways to find Rosie. He was followed by some of the boys from the crowd. "Hey, Skipping Jim," they shouted. "Wait for us." But Jim didn't stop until he'd found Rosie again. The boys panted up to him, cuffing him lightly with their fists to show they wanted to be friends. "Come on, Skipping Jim, dance for us," they shouted, and they stood about in their tattered clothes, hugging themselves against the cold, while Jim capered round to make them laugh. "You'll soon wear those boots out," Rosie warned him. "Save your dancing for the proper customers." But Jim wanted to dance for the boys. They didn't often laugh. There wasn't much to laugh about, not at all. He was always too shy to talk to them. But after that day when they had made them laugh at the doctor, they often came to watch him dance in the streets. One of them was a red-haired, poky sort of boy. He reminded Jim of Tip, just a bit. His hair was bright and untidy, and it poked out the holes in his cap he wore on the side of his head. His toes wriggled like cold pink shrimps out at the ends of his boots, and his shirt hung off of his skinny arms like tattered sails hanging off the spars of a ship. He made a sort of living selling bootlaces. "Bootlaces, mister," he shouted at passers-by, whirling the laces above his head as if they were a ribbon seller at a fair. "3 for the price of 2. You don't want 3, sir? Well, 2 for the price of 3 then. Can't say fairer than that, can I?" When Jim was skipping, the boy used to sit with his mouth wide open, as if he was afraid to laugh out loud. His eyes darted round, furtive, on the lookout all the time for likely customers, or for the police, or for something that he could help himself to. He would suddenly leap up and dash past the stall when the owner wasn't looking, and grab a lump of cheese or broken end of a pie, or a hot muffin. He'd run into the dark corner and stuff his face full of it. Jim reckoned he must swallow it whole. Jim reckoned he must swallow it whole. It disappeared so fast. If the stallholder saw him doing it, they usually swore at him and chased him off. But sometimes they just saw him coming and looked the other way. It never occurred to Jim, watching him, that one day he would be doing this too, and to be thankful to steal even crumbs on a day to keep himself alive. Jim liked the look of this boy. A few times he went over to him to say something, but the boy would just run off as soon as he saw Jim come near, as if he just remembered a job that needed doing. Jim would feel awkward then and would pretend to be searching for something on the ground where the boy had been squatting. But every day he thought, "I'll talk to him today. I'll find out what he's called, that's what." One evening, Just as the dark was coming, the lad was still watching Jim in a nervous, fox-like way, when a raggedy woman crept up behind him. She put her hands on his shoulders and shook him. "Gotcha!" she said. "You been hiding, ain't ya?" He jumped up, trying to get away, but she pushed him to the ground and pinned him there with her knee on his chest. Her hair was as wild and red as his, and her voice was thick and slurred. "Where's your money?" she demanded. "Ain't got none," the boy said. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and record the other bit for you right now.